The accused Long Island serial killer has been charged for the murders of 3 victims found on Gilgo Beach. He has been implicated in a 4th murder. But there are more victims. 7 more victims found in the area. So, as the investigation continues, do detectives believe he is responsible for all the murders, or are there other killers out there? Is it possible there is a second serial killer? And were some of the victims dismembered? If so, is it the work of the same person or a second person? Tonight, we bring in our experts to look at those questions and dive into the mind of the killer who dismembers his or her victims. Killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, Joel Guy, and Taylor Schabusiness, as we continue our in-depth coverage of the Long Island serial killer.
I'm Vinny Politan. Great to have you with us here on Closing Arguments as we continue our coverage of the Gilgo serial killer, the accused Long Island serial killer. And the question really is, are there other victims? Other victims that he is responsible for? You do the timeline here, and he's like in his mid to late 40s when these murders take place. The ones that he's charged with, 3. One that he is suspected in and is expected to be charged with. He says mid to late 40s. So are there other victims before that? Were there any victims after 2010 when the first bodies were found in that stretch of beach on Long Island? And how about those 7 other victims? Is he responsible for those murders? Is he he's an obvious suspect, right? He has to be. If you believe he committed 4 killings there, you have to look at him for the other 7, but are they connected? Are they related? What does the evidence say in this case? Is there any evidence that will link him to those other victims? Whether it's forensic evidence left behind, the way the bodies were found, the state of the bodies. Were they all similarly situated, the way they were bound and wrapped? Were they dismembered? What does that mean? Is it possible that a serial killer can kill some people one way and then other victims another way? Or is this a case where we may be looking for more than one serial killer out in Long Island? What exactly is the situation here? It's a little confusing. And we've gotten a lot of information from investigators so far and from the DA. They've been very forthcoming since the arrest. We've got a better idea about those cases, but they're not taking us inside their investigation. But we have some information about the Gilgo 4, and we have some information about the other victims found in that stretch of beach in Long Island. And tonight, in this hour, that's what I want to talk about, these other victims and dismemberment, because unfortunately, some of these victims, after they were murdered, the body parts were taken apart. What does that mean? What kind of person does that? And is it consistent with this suspect? Again, are we looking for somebody else here? Let's begin by getting a little bit of background about the evidence found at the scene, what's been released so far. Here's Ray Tierney, he's the Suffolk County DA, describing the Gilgo 4.
The victims went missing between July of 2010 and July of 2007 and September of 2010. In December of 2010, they were their bodies were recovered. They were buried in a similar fashion, in a similar location, in a similar way. All the women were petite. They all did the same thing for a living. They were all advertised the same way, and there were immediately there were similarities with regard to the crime scenes. All the women were bound at the head, at the midsection, or at the chest, and later at the legs. The other thing I think that's been talked about in the media was they were bound by burlap. That has taken a life of its own in the media, and the burlap has been described or thought to be the burlap that's used at a nursery. That's not the burlap that was used in this case. The burlap was camouflage burlap used for duck blinds of hunting. Obviously it was used to purposely hide the bodies.
So there they are describing describing the similarities between the Gilgo Four. Let's take a look. You've got Melissa Barthélemy, found December 11th, 2010, nude, wrapped in burlap. Maureen Bernard Barnes, found 2 days later, nude, wrapped in burlap. Amber Lynn Costello, same, found on December 13th, nude, wrapped in burlap. And Megan Waterman as well. Now, 7 other victims on the bottom. What do we know about them? Shannon Gilbert, this is how the whole thing began. She was found a year later in 2011 in a marsh near Oak Beach. This is further away from where these 4 were. Jessica Taylor, found March 29th, 2011. Skull, hands, and right forearm. Torso was found in Manorville in 2003. Okay, so you've got some body parts here, some body parts in another place from 2003. Valerie Mack, found April 4th, 2011. Skull, hands, and right foot. Torso, found in Manorville in 2000. So again, her death predates the death of the Gilgo Four. John Doe, found April 4th, 2011. Unidentified Asian male, 17 to 23. Found reportedly wearing women's clothing. Jane Doe Peaches, found April 11th. Other remains found near Lake Hempstead in 1997. Mother of baby Doe, nicknamed Peaches because of a peach tattoo. So this is an even older case. An unidentified toddler, found April 4th, 2011, 16 to 32 months old, the daughter of the victim Peaches. And then one more Jane Doe, April 11th, 2011, skull of an unidentified female, DNA linked to legs that washed ashore on Fire Island. Again, a dismemberment. So you've got 4 of those 7, some level of dismemberment. What does that mean? Let's try to put some of this together with our great panel of guests. Joining us tonight, forensic death investigator, professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University and the host of the very popular Body Bags podcast, Joseph Scott Morgan. Serial killer expert, professor of forensic science at Boston College, Dr. Ann Burgess is with us. Also joining us, psychologist, researcher, expert on violent crime, and co-author of The New Evil, Dr. Gary Brucato is with us. And finally, former FBI special agent, over 25 years, SWAT team tactical medic of 15 years, expert in organized crime and high-profile arrests. Jennifer Coffendoffer is with us as well. Great to see everyone tonight. Joseph Scott Morgan, I'll begin with you. In what I described, in the way, taking a look at all 11 here, are we looking for more than one? Do you see any potential connections here? What does your gut tell you, and what do you find significant in this evidence?
Well, as it applies to the dismemberment issue relative to human remains, you have someone that has to be motivated in order to do this, and in order to be motivated, they have to become equipped in order to facilitate this. They have to have a sequestered area where they can do this in privacy, someplace that's out of sight, because this takes time in order to facilitate this. And in my experience, at least, with dismemberment, people that have perpetrated multiple dismemberment, there's somewhat of a learning curve. For those of us that have worked in the morgue, we have a protracted period of time to do dissections and certainly the right tools. So it's kind of a learning curve relative to what you might need in order to facilitate this. You have to have comfort being around the dead and being around gore, if you will. And then, to purpose, that's for someone else to state. However, some of the things that we'll be looking for that are left behind, primarily, particularly when it comes to dismemberment, specifically are tool markings. And is there any kind of consistency? Everything from saw marks, band saws, handheld carpenter saws, skill saws. I've seen chainsaws and skill saws used. So is there a consistency in the implement being used?
Dr. Ann Burgess, you've studied all of this. As we're looking at all of these victims, did you see any sort of commonality, or do you think perhaps we are looking for one or more additional killers here?
Well, first on the commonality, I would say that they are accessed in the same way. They are targeted, if you will. But what I'd like to know is what anything done to the body before it's dismembered to illustrate any kind of emotion or what the motive might be. When we initially started looking at this years ago, we talked about murder and mutilation. More recently, the Dr. Mercado and I and others have looked at this in a larger population and have really identified various reasons or motives for the dismemberment. So I'll let him add that part to it.
Dr. Gary Mercado, go ahead.
Well, what Ann and Dr. Victor Petreka and I found at our work at Boston College was that the primary motivation for dismemberment among offenders is actually the elimination of evidence. So that what you see, particularly as modern technology is making it more difficult for people to get away with serial offenses, is this kind of increase in this butchering of bodies, where Ann and I wound up coming up with definitions to distinguish dismemberment from mutilation as a different concept. In our interpretation, if a head, torso, arms, hands, pelvis, legs, or feet are in some way butchered or removed, that would be dismemberment. And the disfigurement or destruction of any smaller part of those pieces of the body would be mutilation. And what we're seeing is people going beyond dismemberment to this total butchering, because the idea is to get rid of everything, even anything that can identify a person, sometimes even things like teeth and tattoo markings and things like that. What's interesting in this case is that if this is a man committing serial sexual homicide who is organized and sort of doing this in the way that these serial offenders typically do, what we'd expect is that if there were dismemberment, it would be in the interest of trying to eliminate evidence. And if we're seeing cases in the series that don't involve it, this might imply somebody who altered his MO or found a different way to eliminate evidence. But I would be curious about that in this case, because what it looks like from the four that are being looked at right now is a very ritualistic, methodical thing that may even been part of a person's ritual of how they were leaving bodies in burlap and bound and so forth, because those victims were entirely intact.
And that's the BTK killer has come out and said, yeah, this guy's a copycat. He's copying me. Jennifer Koffendorfer, looking at this investigation, right? There's the obvious connection between the Gilgo Four. How do you see how it relates to the other seven and the way their bodies are found and what's going on in those investigations? Do you think that we're looking for another killer or killers?
I think it is very possible we are looking for another killer, and I'm judging that from the difference really in modus operandi. Unless they can connect that these targets that were chosen for a similar reason, I think that that is one obstacle that's hard to get over. In other words, we have a child, we have a male, even though he's dressed in female clothing. What were their occupations? This is very important to distinguish. Also, they're going to be looking at where Rex was. where was he at this time? There was still cellular information. There's still going to be witness information, and that's going to be important to see if he was even in these vicinities, what he was doing during these time frames. Also, was any burlap used on any of these other victims in any way, shape, or form? I know it's very difficult since they were dismembered and the body parts were dislodged and found in different places, but these are going to be some of the investigative questions that need to be asked to see if it can be linked together in terms of the investigation itself.
Judge Scott Morgan, let me ask you, it seems the dismembered bodies predate the Gilgo 4. Was there any general change in the way that you could identify or gather evidence from a victim from the late 90s, early 2000s to around 2010 in that area? Is there a change that someone who is reading up on it would say, okay, dismembering the bodies is going to do me no good anymore. I'll just take care of them a different way?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, Vin. When you begin to think about it, going back to there's so much data that's out there now relative to the things that we look for, and in forensics in particular. And so if you have someone that starts off on one track, perhaps there is a learning curve. I've mentioned that previously. Maybe they are trying to get away from this element of tool marking. And it's not just a dissection where you go in to say a knee joint or hip joint or shoulders or whatever, and you dismember the body in this manner. If you're cutting across, for instance, long bones and these sorts of things, you're going to leave very distinctive marks. If this individual is in tune to that, they might be sophisticated enough to try to determine that. One of the problems is that I think with the dismembered bodies, you might have a tougher time trying to determine the cause of death, whereas with the Gilgo 4, I think that it's been opined a number of times that the suspected cause of death was perhaps strangulation. Now, how can you go back and kind of determine that about these bodies that have been dismembered and in a further, more advanced state of decomposition? That would be very difficult to prove.
All right, our guests are staying with us. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about dismemberment, the mindset, talk about people like Jeffrey Dahmer, plus coming up next hour.
In Green Bay, Wisconsin, one of the most disturbing murder cases in court TV history continuing today. Taylor Shabusiness found guilty of murdering, sexually assaulting, and dismembering Shad Therion. Now, this Wisconsin jury must decide if she was legally insane at the time of this brutal attack.
Based on my experience and training, that's a psychotic person right there. To me, it's off the scale. 32 years. I've seen a lot of psychotic people, bipolar, psychotic, manic, and I just haven't seen very many like this.
They were high school sweethearts reunited.
Now he's accused of shooting her husband, and she's serving a life sentence.
Jennifer Faith pleaded guilty to orchestrating the murder of her husband.
Dark eyes and coming toward me.
The alleged gunman, a military veteran who suffered a traumatic brain injury.
A case of greed and manipulation.
The Boyfriend Hitman Murder Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings at 8/7 Central on Court TV.
Where I'm going with my next set of questions is pointed at why these events extended beyond the homosexual and got into the situation where you actually took the lives of your victims. And
I'd like to know the reason for that too. I don't know.
Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, also known for taking apart his victims and cannibalism. Unreal stuff. It was a case that we covered here on Court TV years ago. Here's one of the survivors. Tracy Edwards was his name. He testified at Dahmer's trial. Let's take a listen.
Okay, first of all, it seemed like a normal apartment. When we got inside, he turned off burglar alarms. I asked him why. First, it was a foul odor, okay?
Tell us about that. What kind of an odor?
It was just like an odor. I didn't quite know what it was. You know, he told me a sewer pipe had broke and management would take care of it. I turned to the right, like the fish tank is here. I'm turning all the way over here.
You turn to your right to look at it?
To look at the fish tank, right.
And when that happens, what happens to you?
All of a sudden, a handcuff and a knife is pulled on me. Yeah.
Handcuff is placed on your body? Where?
On my left wrist.
And you see a knife?
Yeah, the knife, yeah.
What'd you do? What'd you say to him?
I asked him what the problem was, you know, that it's not necessary to do this, you know.
What'd he say?
He told me at that point if I wouldn't do what he said, he would kill me, yeah.
What did you do when you got in the bedroom as he's holding on to the cuff and the knife? What did you do?
Studied us talking, trying to be friends with him, you know.
Did you remain standing? Did you sit down?
He made me sit down at that point. We both sit on the bed. Right.
Was it at the foot of the bed, side of the bed, head of the bed?
Maybe halfway between.
Did that room have a TV set in it?
Yes.
Was there anything going on the TV?
Yeah, the Exorcist movies was playing at that time.
Did you observe him watching the movie and how he would react to the movie?
Right, he would like just start rocking back and forth when he, you know, certain parts of the movie or whatever.
You have to say, what did he say, madam?
It was like chanting in certain times and rocking back and forth, right?
Tell us about his chanting. What was that all about?
I'm not even sure, sir, but it was just like, I can't tell you the words. I couldn't understand what he was saying at that time.
Can you mimic him? How it sounded?
It was like a slow slur, like, some of that nature, something close like that, I'm not sure.
Okay, did you and he move off of the bed at any time?
Yes, he wanted me to lay flat down, stomach down on the floor at that time.
Okay, now, but tell us, did he still have the knife out?
Yes, he still had the knife with him.
And what did you do?
Okay, I kind of like laid on my sides. For some reason, I guess God told me not to lay flat down or let this person handcuff me, so I didn't.
So you were trying to stop that from happening, but you got down on the floor.
Right.
What did he do?
He kind of laid across me, put his head across my chest at that point.
What was he doing with his head?
Pardon me?
What did it appear to you he was doing with his head? What was he trying to do?
Like he was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
Absolutely chilling. Let's bring back in our guests tonight, Joseph Scott Morgan, Dr. Ann Burgess, Dr. Gary Brucata, and Jennifer Koffendorfer. Dr. Ann Burgess, let's talk about Jeffrey Dahmer and the motivation, the mindset for the dismemberment in one of the most notorious cases ever.
Well, with Jeffrey Dahmer, he had a very clear fantasy that he was acting out with his victims. And as the victim in the clip that you just showed that he was trying to listen to his heart. He was probably trying to see about what he had given him to see if it made any effect. So in a way, he was more curious about the inside workings of this particular victim. And as we know from some of his other victims, that was what he would do. He would take part of the body parts and he would try, at one point wanted to cook them and eat them. This is very different motive than what we discussed earlier.
Absolutely. Dr. Gary Brucata, you know, you talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, and I mean, everyone knows the story, and you think of what it takes to do what he did. But what you told us in the first segment is this would be the outlier when it comes to killers who dismember their victims?
Yes, Jeffrey Dahmer would be somebody who falls into the less frequent category of motivation for dismemberment, mutilation. When Jeffrey Dahmer was interviewed about his motivations, one of the things he said that was extremely interesting was that he was motivated by a desire to make people permanent by eating them. The idea was that he was sort of sick of losing everybody in his life. In fact, his first victim was somebody that he was trying to prevent from leaving him after they had spent a long time embracing each other, after he had picked up a hitchhiker that he came to like very much. And he wound up hitting him over the head with a barbell and sort of liking the idea that he could never leave. And he eventually moved into the idea that ingesting the victim was a way of kind of introjecting them into the self, bringing them permanently into the self. He also got quite a bit of sexual arousal from what he was doing with body parts. And so we have this idea of a person who doesn't really need a whole human being to be satisfied in a relationship, but could actually relate to a body part as if it were something that he was having a personal relationship with. So there, what we have is a person who is dismembering not for the elimination of evidence, but for psychosexual reasons and for ideas that had to do with this peculiar psychology about the preservation of a love object. And there are other motivations that I'm sure we'll talk about as the show progresses, but he was someone who was motivated by these very unusual reasons.
Jennifer Koffendorfer, I'm listening to all our experts tonight, and I'm getting the feeling that when we go back to Gilgo Beach, we go back to Long Island, we look at those victims, it seems the dismemberment there with the body parts separated maybe, I believe, a lot different than what we are hearing about someone like Jeffrey Dahmer in the motivation for all of this.
Absolutely. It seems that it was truly to hide the crime and to hide the victim. And really, it is parallel to what we're seeing in the Lisk case, the Gilgo 4 specifically, from the standpoint of using burlap, using camouflage burlap specifically to hide. So I was wondering, could this possibly be a progression? In other words, he realized that dismemberment is so difficult and painstaking and time-consuming. Did he progress and say, I really don't need to do that anymore? I can camouflage by using burlap. So I think that's a consideration.
Joseph Scott Morgan, when you think of Jeffrey Dahmer, what are the images that come into your mind?
Well, I think that, you know, the esteemed panel has pointed out a couple of times here that one of the purposes for dismemberment is to kind of disassociate the actions of one individual from these bodies. And with Dahmer, the thing was he was holding on to these items within the sphere in which he lived. He was even attempting to render down some of these remains. We see those large buckets or tanks being brought out. I had friends that worked at the Milwaukee ME's office at that particular time and had visited there in the wake of this case, and they would tell me these chilling stories about everything. And even by our standards, Finn, in the medical legal world, it was chilling for us to understand what was going on inside of that apartment. He was not trying to put distance necessarily between himself and the remains, so it's a completely different type of animal in that particular case.
Now, Jeffrey Dahmer did motivate, I believe, another killer in Wisconsin. It's a trial that just concluded today. Take a look at this image, folks. That's Taylor Schabusiness smiling next to a photo of Jeffrey Dahmer. Why? Was that one of the motivating factors that led her to psychosexually murder and dismember and sexually assault her victim, Shad Therion? We'll talk about that next.
These are the cases that captivated the world.
Couldn't keep my life straight.
That demanded our attention.
They were killed by their own children.
That challenged the legal system and ourselves.
How in the world can a mother wait 30 days before reporting her child missing?
These are the trials that became legendary. And now you can relive them all in one place. Court TV Legendary Trials. Go to courttv.com/legendary trials to find out how to watch.
Dr. Based on your training and experience, what kind of amount of time would be necessary in order to create this sort of disruption to a body?
It is my medical opinion that this would be quite a few hours. We have decapitation, we have dismemberment, we have transection of the torso. The body has been eviscerated. In other words, we have entered inside the body through various cuts, both at the abdomen and between the ribs, where the victim's organs have been removed, largely one by one.
Taylor Shabiznis dismembered after she murdered her friend, Shad Therion, her friend. Now, we just had a verdict a short while ago. We're going to have full coverage of that verdict regarding her state of mind. Jury found that she was not legally insane at the time that she committed this murder. Chanley Painter will join us at the top of the hour. But I want you to take a listen to Taylor Shabiznis in her interrogation, talking about what she did, again, to her friend. Let's listen.
What did you do with the head?
The head I put in that bucket, that black bucket.
Black bucket?
With the blanket on top.
Okay. And then where'd you leave it?
Leave the head? The head's still in the bucket. It's right by the stairs.
By the stairs? Okay. How did you dismember his body then?
Knives.
With what?
Knives.
Knives? Just more than one knife?
About 4.
Where'd you get those from?
Kitchen.
4 knives from the kitchen. She went upstairs from the basement to the kitchen. Unbelievable. Let's bring back in our panel. Still with us, Joseph Scott Morgan, Dr. Gary Brucata, and Jennifer Coffendoffer. Let me ask you, Dr. Gary Brucata, Taylor Shabiznis, we saw that smiling photo with Jeffrey Dahmer. Her friend is her victim. She goes upstairs to get the knives. What are your thoughts about the mindset and the motivation behind this dismemberment?
Right. What's a little difficult about this is we have to remember what was being looked at is the question of whether there was an appreciation of the distinction between right and wrong. In other words, did an individual's mental defect, which may or may not existed, make them incapable of telling the difference? That does not preclude a person having a history of mental illness, which it's been publicly reported that Shabiznis did. But in addition, you had all kinds of drugs that were, raised as having been involved here. And what we see when it comes to dismemberment, particularly with females who dismember, who are really very unusual, is that usually they are motivated by severe mental illness or drug use. That doesn't mean the individual doesn't know what he or she is doing at the time. So what I think is this is an example of somebody where that has to be thought of in terms of why there was such brutality, such a mismatch between the feelings the person has and that they should be having towards friends, the kind of giggling in the courtroom and all of that. I think we have to separately consider, is there a mental illness and did it prevent knowing the difference between right and wrong? But this is what we would see in somebody where there might be something going on like that in mind, drugs or mental illness.
Jennifer, I'm looking at her in court, right? And you see these reactions and the way she is showing herself to the world, showing herself to the jury. And she talks so casually about what she did, again, to her friend, Shad Therion. I mean, they went to high school together. It wasn't like she was out to kill some stranger. And to me, the way she described just using the knives, going upstairs, extremely, she wasn't trying to hide anything here.
No, and it is very interesting, and it's hard to watch somebody that is actually takes something that is so horrific and describes it like how you would describe cleaning your closet out. It's just so matter of fact. The brutality that she talks about, the knives, how she said that, her expressions in court, all of this seems just so very detached. And for people who, personally, I've interviewed, it's odd to see people talk about brutal crimes and things that are so out of what we would say is any sense of normal. in such a normal manner. And it really has become normal to them.
Joseph Scott Morgan, a lot of evidence really struck me in this case, including the dismembering of his sexual organ and spending time with that as well. Bizarre stuff. And then I heard what we were talking about with Jeffrey Dahmer and the way, you know, he attached himself to body parts. And she's there with a picture of herself with Jeffrey Dahmer. Do you think there was any level of motivation here, or what else is going on?
Yeah, this is an out-and-out sexual assault on a corpse. And she joins a very interesting group, Vinny. I need to remind people of something. In 1957, Ed Gein was arrested in Wisconsin, and he was a bona fide necrophile, grave robbing, mutilation of corpses. He was sexually motivated to a great degree, and some of the most horrific things you can imagine. And so she's emulating Dahmer, who notoriously is not just a serial killer, he's also a necrophile, Vin. And, you know, he'd work out these fantasies. And the things, I sat and watched this Shabusiness case, and, you know, there's just some moments that you and I have shared, Vin, over the years where you feel like you wish you could take your brain out and scrub it with Comet afterwards. The things that she did beyond just the mutilation and dismemberment, but, you know, sexually with this young man's body are beyond the pale. So, yeah, there's some other type of motivation here. And it certainly wasn't to necessarily separate herself from the body. Remember, she's driving a van that one element of the body is actually found in. So, very odd set of circumstances in this particular case.
Joel Guy was another convicted killer here on Court TV. Take a look at him. Murdered and dismembered his parents, Joel Guy Sr. and Lisa Guy. Stabbed his father 42 times, his mother 31 times. At trial, the prosecutor said that the couple was planning to retire soon and would stop supporting their son. Here's the part that everyone remembers, Dr. Gary Brucato. There was a pot on the stove. Police described the scene as a diabolical stew of human remains, finding the father's severed hands on the floor and his mother's head in a pot on the stove. Your thoughts about Joel Guy?
What's interesting about the Joel Guy case is that it really falls into a category that I've called in my work elimination murder, which is essentially a person that is trying to get somebody out of the way who is an impediment to something like money or a romantic partner and so forth. In the case of Joel Gray, the motivation appears to have been that the parents were going to financially cut him off, and he would have inherited a very large amount of money from a policy if they were eliminated. And as is typical in elimination murders, this whole cover story was created to try to explain how they were killed by somebody else and so forth. What's interesting, though, is that it seems clear that in perpetrating this elimination murder, he sort of went so beyond the pale of what was necessary to eliminate them that we see this explosion of anger that I think makes it very clear how he felt about these people that he was eliminating. And we found in our research that this extreme butchery, because of the anger that explodes, that sort of overkill, could sometimes be present when, for example, you kill intimates, family members, and dismember them with extreme butcheries. The hands are in one place, the head is over here, etc. So I think we have to see it as an expression of how much he loathed these people. So that what we're looking at today are really very different types of dismemberment.
Yeah, unfortunately, Gary, we're out of time. I'm up against a break. I'm so sorry, but we're gonna do this again and obviously have you on again. Joseph Scott Morgan, Dr. Gary Brucato, Jennifer Koffendorfer, and Dr. Ann Burgess. Appreciate everyone coming on tonight. We'll see you again soon.